Hello, and welcome to the virtual Wilson Center. I'm Robert Litvak, the Wilson Center Senior Vice President, and I'm delighted to be introducing today's discussion of a wonderful new book by my colleague, Blair Ruble. The book is Portraying the Soul of a People, African Americans Confront Wilson's Legacy from the Washington Stage. The Washington African American theater community mobilized to respond to the segregationist policies of the Wilson administration through the creation of new works, which range from plays addressing lynching to more general works portraying the domestic life of African Americans. Howard University professors set out to establish a National Negro Theater based on the models of the Irish National Theater. While that initiative did not succeed, the resulting Howard Players, now 101 years old, has enriched American and Washington theater. Blair's marvelous new book traces their endeavors, as well as subsequent efforts at Howard University and in Washington, to present African Americans on stage with dignity and respect. Blair Ruble is known probably to most on this call who've been following the Wilson Center from some time. We've been colleagues for 37 years or roughly. He is, I think it's fair to say, the Wilson Center's Renaissance man. I mean, the breadth and depth of his knowledge really is extraordinary. I mean, I got to know him through his work. He directed the Kennan Institute, but then found out about his deep interest in kind of urban studies. He went on to direct the comparative urban studies program at Wilson and brought urban issues to Wilson. His knowledge extends to jazz, and I think also, as a sideline, he's got an encyclopedic knowledge of hockey, judging from the memorabilia on his desk. Before joining the Wilson Center, and Blair is old Wilson Center the way I am, he worked at the Social Science Research Council. He had been at Kennan as an associate. He came back then to direct the program, did a wonderful institution building and providing intellectual focus to the Kennan Institute for two plus decades, whatever it turned out to be, Blair. Blair, probably longer, excuse me, check myself. Blair has been remarkably prolific. His latest work was The Muse of Urban Delirium, examined how new forms of performing art emerge at moments of uncertain social identity in cities undergoing rapid transformation. And if you wonder about his Renaissance man credentials, there's a chapter in there on Rome, on the Italian cities, on Naples and its rise, and it just opened my eyes to additional areas of Blair's expertise. But his heart, I mean, he lives in Washington, D.C., and his heart's in Washington, D.C., and a part of his head's in Washington, D.C. He's written marvelous books, including Washington's U Street, which has gone through a renaissance during the time I've been in Washington. It's been wonderful to see. Creating Diversity Capital, and a trilogy examining the fate of Russian provincial cities during the 20th century. Various urban studies, which really kind of brought focus to his work in the urban area. He's edited more than 20 books on a host of topics with a host of different institutions. He's written in opinion pages in the newspapers of record, from the New York Times and Washington Post to the Asian Wall Street Journal, appeared on the media discussing these issues. So today is we mark this another landmark achievement by Blair Ruble. We're so fortunate that he remains affiliated to the Wilson Center as a distinguished fellow. Now, Blair will provide an overview of his new book, and we're delighted that one of our most distinguished alums, Maurice Jackson, who's a professor of history and African American studies and the performing arts at Georgetown University, could participate today to engage with Blair on these issues. The two have a kind of long-standing kind of record of interlocutorship, if I may, of they discussing these issues. So we're delighted that Professor Jackson could be with us. He came to academia after many years working as a community and human rights organizer. and he had held a variety of jobs before that were not in academia. An impressive background. Like Blair, is a longtime Washingtonian. Indeed, his entire life has been spent in Washington, and it's his record of service to this community that earned him a spot in the Hall of Fame of Washington in 2009. And 3 years later, he was a fellow at the Wilson Center. He's one of our distinguished and cherished alums. We thank him for participating today. I learned a lot in the reading of it. This was an area that's sort of outside of my areas of expertise. So I learned so much in reading kind of Blair's work. I look forward to today's discussion. The format is going to be Blair will open with an overview of his book, and that will then provide a basis for Professor Jackson to comment on any issues he sees raised by it. And the two of them are going to kind of engage in a conversation for the remainder of this time. So with that, Blair, over to you.
Rob, thank you very much. And thank you for really a wonderful, collegial and generous introduction. I think both of us have been around the center a long time and know how important true collegiality is. And I can't think of a better colleague than Rob. And it's a pleasure to be talking about this subject with Maurice. Maurice and I have collaborated on a couple of projects, and he's always an interesting and thoughtful and really insightful commentator. I know that someplace in his office there's a well marked up book, because that's how he organizes his thoughts. So I want to thank Maurice for doing this. Woodrow Wilson's decision to screen D.W. Griffith's scurrilous film about the Ku Klux Klan, Birth of a Nation, set off waves of protest. Among those who began to organize and make this a flashpoint in their objections to Wilson was the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which then was only about 6 years old. Wilson's administration had already earned the enmity of Washington's robust African-American community. More than half of the 20th century regulations and laws limiting the lives of African Americans in Washington took effect during the Wilson administration. As a acerbic editor of the African American newspaper, the Washington Bee, William Calvin Chase put it, Wilson had earned the everlasting damnation of colored Americans, both in Washington and across the nation. So it's against this backdrop that the screening of Birth of a Nation takes place. In 1916, early 1916, just months after the screening, Edward Christopher Williams and Carrie Clifford convened a drama committee of the new DC chapter of the NAACP to focus on Wilson's policies in general, as well as on a wave of lynchings that were taking place across southern states, and how all of this related to Griffith's film, most particularly. Williams was the first professional African-American librarian. He died tragically in 1929 while working on his PhD at Columbia University, but he really gained lasting recognition for those of us who know and are interested in Washington for his novel of manners about the city's Black bourgeoisie of the era called When Washington Was in Vogue. And the book is still available. If you have any interest at all in Washington life, it's really worth taking a look at. Clifford was an activist and a writer, an associate of W.E.B. Du Bois, and one of the original supporters of the Niagara movement. They were joined by Anna Julia Cooper, the famous activist who was born into slavery and would earn a PhD from the Sorbonne. Alain Locke, the first African-American Rhodes Scholar who was teaching at Howard. Ernest Just, who was a well-recognized zoologist at Howard, and Thomas Montgomery Gregory, who would head up the English department at Howard. This was no modest group, and it wasn't. It was a very serious effort to engage Wilson. Just one very small, kind of silly indication of the power of the group, but nonetheless, it's telling that half of the group members ended up on US postal stamps. So these are people of real accomplishment. The group struggled with how best to challenge Griffith's reformulation of history and to do so specifically from the stage. The discussions helped to establish the contours of debates over the nature of Black theater and would help shape Washington theater as well throughout the rest of the decade. Was Black drama to be propaganda responding to the enmity of white America? Or was it to be a form of self-expression written by Blacks for Black audiences and performed by Blacks? While reality is always more complicated than that kind of simplistic reduction to a formulaic expression, these debates generally took the form of a supposed conflict between propaganda and folk expression. Now, initially, the committee supported a production of Angelina Well Grimke's anti-lynching play, Rachel. Grimke's play was the first of several anti-lynching plays written at the time by Washington women playwrights. Authors such as Mary Brill, Georgia Douglas Johnson, Alice Dunbar Nelson, and others. It was there was a school of playwrights trying to respond to lynching. And they wanted to do so by showing both the horrors of lynching, but also the pernicious impact on African-American domestic life. And Rachel was generally viewed as the first of these plays. Now, in exchange for supporting that production, Howard professors Gregory and Locke assumed that the committee would then later support the kinds of folk drama they were interested in. Folk dramas which showed the ebb and flow of African-American life and would be very much in the new modernist tradition that was emerging through works produced at the Provincetown Players and elsewhere. When the committee refused to support those efforts, Gregory and Locke resigned and returned to campus and tried to establish a National Negro Theater. As Rob has already mentioned, this vision of a National Negro Theater was really built upon the accomplishments of the Irish National Theater that had been established a few years before by W.B. Yeats and Lady Gregory. For Thomas Montgomery Gregory, the Irish National Theater enabled Irish authors to tell their own stories unmediated by the pens and performances of others. He drew on other models as well. He studied at Harvard with George Pierce Baker, and he had ties to the Provincetown Players and the Carolina Playmakers. And what he wanted to do was to combat what he viewed as the unracing of African-American culture by its effort to appease white cultural gatekeepers and to produce something that really spoke in a new voice to African-Americans, from African-Americans. And he saw the opportunity created by Griffith's film to push this plan forward. He drew on resources available to him as chair of the English department and set out in 1919 to transform student drama clubs to a substantial new company, the Howard Players. Locke, like Gregory, argued that a university provided the most congenial base for this effort. Locke was concerned that commercial endeavors in places like New York and Chicago would be too mercurial and that you really needed the solid base provided by a university. It's important to understand at the time that both Gregory and Locke were revolutionaries seeking to overthrow racial stereotypes that had dominated the American stage since well before the Revolution. They weren't the first. There was an effort to transform the place of African Americans on the musical stage beginning in the 1890s. And you had many Black artists, including Will Marion Cook, who was the son of the dean of the Howard Law School, studied in Berlin, violin in Berlin, and worked with Antonin Dvorak. You had Cook and the poet Paul Laurence Dunbar, James Reese Europe, another Washington-born musician, Eubie Blake from Baltimore. These were figures who were trying to reinvent the musical theater in a way that would push it away from the derogatory stereotypes of the minstrel show and to create a new musical tradition that was less tied to burlesque and more shaded towards operetta. Now, their efforts were incomplete and they were difficult, but nonetheless, white audiences were more willing to accept more complete portrayals of African Americans in musicals than they were in drama. And hostility towards nuanced and holistic portrayals of Blacks in drama on the American stage was much more intense and entrenched. And this second revolution was the one which Gregory and Locke wanted to bring about. And for them, the response to Griffiths and to Wilson opened the door to try to make that happen. Gregory and Locke developed curriculum covering all aspects of the theatrical arts at Howard. They worked closely with the Provincetown Players to present Charles Gilpin and Eugene O'Neill's Emperor Jones. They performed for the delegates at the 1922 Washington Naval Conference. H.G. Wells was in the audience, by the way. And they took their players to high schools and commercial theaters around Washington and Baltimore. Now, Gregory and Locke, as I mentioned, had argued for university-based theatrical groups as presenting the best hope to bring about meaningful change in the presentation of African Americans on the American stage. In this regard, they were wrong. By mid-decade, they both would be dismissed from Howard. Locke would return and continue to work with others at Howard, including Sterling Brown and later Owen Dotson, to sustain a very high-quality drama program, one that would produce such well-known artists as Ossie Davis, Debbie Allen, Felicia Rashad, and of course, most recently, Chadwick Boseman. But the center of gravity for generating and producing African-American theater moved to New York. Gregory never returned to Howard, although he would keep strong family ties to Washington. His father had been the first graduate of Howard, so he had strong ties to the community around Howard. But he would move to the Atlantic City school system and from there continue to participate in efforts to create Black theater in New Jersey, in New York, and here in DC. It's important to realize that the Washington contribution to African American theater was not limited to the NAACP Drama Committee at Howard University. The city sustained a really vibrant community that was contributing to Black theater throughout much of the 20th century. In particular, Willis Richardson, who spent much of his life working at the U.S. Bureau of Engraving and Printing, became the first African-American playwright to have a play produced on Broadway with his 1923 work, The Chip Woman's Fortune. And he was author of dozens of plays, including Compromise, which appeared in Budapest in 1931. Georgia Douglas Johnson, whom I already have mentioned, is an author of anti-lynching plays, hosted a famous Saturday night salon, dinner and salon, which attracted the participation of leading African-American intellectuals from around the country every Saturday night. People like Du Bois and Langston Hughes and Mary Church Terrell and Carter Woodson and Zora Neale Hurston were all regulars at these salons. And importantly for this story, Richardson was a regular participant and would organize discussions throughout the 1930s, focusing on the challenges facing African-American theater. There remains much more to be said about the contributions of Washington and Washingtonians to African-American theater, but I'm going to leave it here for now and return back to Woodrow Wilson.
Well, thank you, Blair, for
Let
that
me-
one, excuse me.
One final point.
Oh, please.
Acrimony was guaranteed when Williams, Clifford, Cooper, Locke, Gregory, and Just sat down to discuss Griffith's film. Each of the participants embraced differing calculations of the appropriate balance among education, aesthetics, and commerce for constituting the value of theater. The ensuing rancor became so intense that Locke and Gregory would resign and return to Howard campus. But these divisions, often starkly presented as in polemics as a divide between propaganda and art, weren't really as deep as they may seem. They all represented an effort to lay out the boundaries of an African-American theater that would be distinctive and give voice to communities of color. They all look to confront the American denial of full citizenship on the basis of color. And they remain in part of a larger effort to sustain the soul of a people, as Willis Richardson liked to put it, and the soul of a community. Thank you.
Thank you, Blair. Your cue of bringing it back to Wilson just threw me for a second. I didn't know if you were throwing it back to me to kind of move the conversation along, but that was an excellent conclusion to your really superb overview of the book. And for those viewing on the web broadcast, Blair's book is available on the Wilson Center website. It's an ebook that you can download and enjoy, and is a resource for you available there. Now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Professor Jackson. Blair's put a lot on the table there for you to consider and to reflect on, and to share with us your views on these issues. Professor Jackson. You're muted.
Thank you, Blair, for having me. Thank you, Robert. And it's always very good to be at the Wilson Center. I had a wonderful year there, and hello to Kim and to Arlen and to Lindsay and my many friends there. Blair has put a lot on the table, and I'll look at a little bit of the history. We come back to theater. This is when Wilson comes to office. At a certain point, African Americans had thought they had made certain gains. Remember that Booker T. Washington went to the White House in 1901, and with Roosevelt, the Theodore Roosevelt, and in some years, of course, there was a big rancor about that. By when Wilson comes in, he writes Wilson a letter because blacks had been denied rights they thought in some cases had. In Washington, D.C. is the big assortment, and I think Blair did a good job, starting with people like Will Marion Cook, whose father was a dean, who was classically trained in music, who was supported by Frederick Douglass, who Frederick Douglass helped go to the academy. And Douglass, of course, has this great love of culture. And when Blair mentions which I didn't know, that Ireland had been the national model for theater, of course, Frederick Douglass has this great relationship to Ireland, going back to the 1840s. Many other formations are starting in Washington, D.C. The Bethel Literary Society. Before we got the drama, we had literature, and the Bethel Literary Society started in the late 1890s. And they had all these great programs. Frederick Douglass would speak, William Marion Cook, all the great black leaders would come down and speak to this basically elite grouping. The American Negro Academy is formed of top-notch African-American scholars. And then women begin to play this great role. Anna Julia Cooper. And when Blair mentioned Anna Julia Cooper, and I'll come back with her, you must remember that Anna Julia Cooper, in order to get a PhD, she has to go to France. Du Bois has to go to Germany for a while. Locke, before he can go to Howard, goes to Germany. And many others. Gregory goes to Germany. Ernest Just has to go to Vienna at first. So you have all of these formations. Then you have this crisis of lynching that Blair spoke about, and as Grimsky put the play out. But you must remember that before we get to this, Ida B. Wells had written her Red Record, and she had documented all the lynchings, 300 a year. And there's a big march in Washington where the suffragists come in 1915, and they refuse to allow Black people to participate. And this great lady who was the architect of the struggle against lynching, and you know it's only this past year that the Senate passed the law against lynching. The House still hasn't passed it, some 100 years later. So you have all of this happening. Then, as Blair says, you have the rise of the NAACP. But with the rise of the NAACP, you also have the notion of the internationalism of Blacks, because everywhere Blacks are participating, it's an international scene. And they helped form the Pan-African Congress conference, then the Pan-African Congress. This in light with what the NAACP, what the internationalism is. And in this, Du Bois plays his role. And with him, Washington people like Rayford Logan, like Anna Julia Cooper, and like Mary Church Terrell. And as this forms, the movement of Black intellectuals takes a special hold. And Du Bois brings his Ethiopian pageant there with Samuel Colbert Taylor. And then, of course, you had World War I, and as Blair and I know, you have African Americans who've gone over and fought in World War I, like James Reese Europe, and with them they take jazz and they bring it back. So you have all of these things going on, as Blair mentioned. And then the question of the theater with Gregory. It's very interesting in looking at Montgomery Gregory, because as he goes to Harvard, and who's he at Harvard with? The same year, as Blair points out, he's there with John Reed. John Reed, who of course wrote 10 Days That Shook the World, who goes to Russia and looks at the Russian Revolution. And then the Provincetown Players, he's a part of that. Later on, it's Paul Robeson, who's active with the Providence Players, but also later plays with Othello and things like that. And who's there? But Dreiser, Edward Dreiser, William Dreiser. So with Theodore Dreiser, you have this internationalism. So Blacks are not just part of themselves; they're part of this big international conflagration. And then Howard, Howard University and Blair, it's up and it's down. As you remember, that in the 30s and 40s, Howard wouldn't even let jazz on campus. In 30s and 40s, Howard had this notion of just being classically trained. As you remember, at Howard, the ladies formed something called the treble clef club, and the treble clef, as opposed to bass clef, it is this group of African American ladies, but they will only play high class music, classical music. So you have these back and forths going on, and Howard is as this bastion. And then Locke, who comes. Remember, at first, when Locke wants to start an African American studies program, the president of Howard, Durkin, would not allow him to do it. And it's only years later, when Mordecai Johnson comes, that it starts. So you have all of these tensions still at Howard, and therefore, when this notion of the theater comes, it is very important. It is not just of itself; it is of many different forms that has brought this about. And I think Blair alluded to it, is debate within African Americans about the role of drama and culture. And Du Bois only did in 1926, the criteria of Negro art. Should art be for propaganda purposes? Remember, Du Bois says, I don't give a damn about art, it's not political. And it's the big debate with George Schuyler and many others, because some say the art should only be for art's sake. It is beauty in itself. It has to be no other purpose. And it's a debate that still goes on. But the African Americans have generally seen art as being a form of expression. And therefore, when we read the papers, and I saw the program in New York Times yesterday, and it had the top protest art, piece of art and culture. And of course, it went to Candace Wilder's piece there in Richmond. So you have all of this. Then the theater plays this great role. And you have different aspects of the theater. Remember that when Blair talks about Richardson, the point is that he brings forth a working class art. This is not the art of some of the others, but he brings forth the working class art, talking about working people, talking about the lives of working people are there. And in this, he's supported in part by Mordecai Johnson, who becomes the first president of Howard. So you have all of these trends that that exist. It is not just one forward movement. And therefore the theater, and by the time we get up to the 60s and things like that, then of course the Black Repertory and others, Black Repertory Theater and others are playing a role. Lastly, I'd like to say this. It's very interesting how the whole thing works out. Anna Julia Cooper directs a play in around 1900, and she directs a Shakespearean play. You see, as they are looking at art, It is black art, but they are not rejecting the art that comes before them. They are not rejecting the great classical artists. And of course, this is the way that Alain Locke is trained. Richardson is looking at working class, looking at for more for working people and takes it there, but he's not rejecting it either. And Sterling Brown comes, and the great Sterling Brown, as we know, he did not consider himself a part of this a movement per se, but it viewed himself as a Southern folklorist. And he plays a great role in this theater. So it is all encompassing. Lastly, let me just say, you know, you look at a person like Ernest Just, who's a zoologist. Long before, you know, now the big term is interdisciplinary, but Ernest Just was a world-class zoologist, but also he was a man who was deeply engraved in the work of the drama and the theater at Howard. So always you saw there, this movement of African-American people across many, many worlds, all moving towards one goal, that is towards freedom and democracy.
Thank you, Professor Jackson. Blair, Professor Jackson provided a rich context within which your study, you know, is really sits. And I'd be interested just to initiate the discussion, and I'm going to try to hand off to the two of you to interact as much as possible. You know, how you see that context, okay? And if I might just add a second point that just for the two of you to kind of continue on, both you, Blair, and Professor Jackson in the comments talked about this duality, propaganda versus art, and this sort of persisting debate there. I think that's sort of an interesting theme that I'd like to see the two of you tease out in conversation. But why don't you start with the context?
Well, Maurice is you can't top Maurice, and he really provided a wonderful view of the context of the story I'm trying to tell. And I think there are a couple of important threads in that context that I want to kind of tug at a little bit. The first is the international. I think it's very important to understand that the people involved in the creation of African-American theater in Washington and in general involved in African-American life and intellectual life in Washington really were very extensively connected and deeply tied to international intellectual movements. You mentioned Rayford Logan. He was very much involved right after World War I. And I'm going to come back to World War I in a moment. I mentioned in passing, but it's an interesting point that Richardson had plays produced in Budapest. And that in some ways, these were artists and intellectuals who were more connected internationally than they were to white society in Washington. And that this I think is part of the impact of Wilson. Maurice mentions that things have been looking up under Teddy Roosevelt, but the Wilson administration really does draw a line, and it's a very pernicious line that affects first African Americans in Washington, because this is the capital and many African Americans work in the federal government, but it really is a turning point in the story. And I think it's important to understand, and Maurice brings this out very well, that there was not a passive response, but a very active response to this on the part of African Americans. And I think theater, in the theater story, is part of that active response. I think World War I is very important to the story because you had a number of African American veterans returning home, having been treated as heroes, particularly in France, and they come back, and what do they find in Washington? They find hostility. There are the events in July 1919, which Maurice, I know, can talk about, where white Southern veterans, prompted by editorials in the Washington Post, among other sources, went out to, quote, clean up Washington and basically tried to push down African Americans who then actually, because of the veterans, fought back. And I think so the theater is part of a bigger story. And what's interesting about it is the African community in Washington, and again, if you take a look at Richardson, it included a reach into blue collar communities as well, was part of a much larger story in ways in which you might argue white Washington wasn't. So this is part of the tensions as well. And maybe Maurice can respond, and then we'll pick up the other question in a moment.
Yeah, we'll get to the question, the political role of art versus its sort of more traditional, like, characterizing the soul of a culture, so to speak. We'll get back to that duality. But Professor Jackson, Blair referred to the disturbances in 1919. And can you talk a bit about the responses to Wilson that just sort of went beyond what Blair focuses on in his book on the development of an independent theater?
Well, thank you. 1919, so black soldiers to come back from the war just as white soldiers. The difference is sometimes black soldiers had to fight for the right to fight. Howard University became a place where blacks fought to establish training bases. The white power system did not want that to happen. Blacks, I just wrote about a young kid, Sylvester Duckett, who was 15, who in 1916 snuck away from Washington against his mother's will, went to New York, shipped out, went to Paris, fought in the front, buried at the Battle of Argonne, died 1 year after he left. In many such cases, James Reese Europe goes there with his music called jazz, and the French accept him open-handedly. He wins the Croix de Guerre. When he comes back to the United States, he is not even wanted to march up Fifth Avenue. So you have this discrimination. So look, and it tells the stories of the day. Whenever there's been hardship in America, at least whenever I've seen economic hardships or things like that, it creates strife amongst people. In this case, a lot of white soldiers blame blacks because they could not get the jobs they had when they left, and other reasons. And it's always some reason, but it's generally somebody's makes up a lie that some black man has bumped some white woman. You can count the cases on your hand where actually African-American men really did molest white women like that. Some, of course, you'd be a fool, you're lynched. Whether you did or not. So you had all of these. Okay, so blacks came, white men by the grove started attacking blacks, and Chalmers Roberts has written about this. He says this was the worst moment in the Washington Post history, because the Washington Post published ads and for vigilante crowds to come and gather up. Not far from where the Wilson Center is, actually, on Murders Bay and places like that. And black and white men started attacking blacks right and left, pulling them off of buses and subways. And then the big thing comes, some of these black men had been trained in the army, and they went to Baltimore and they started bringing some guns back, and they fought back. And as James Weldon Johnson wrote, who was the head of the NAACP, a peaceful man who wrote in his favorite voice and sing, said for the first time African-Americans had fought back with weapons as one. And when they did that, the riots stopped almost the next day. But the riots occurred in about 25 cities all over the country, and black men were slaughtered. And so this happens at the same time, as you remember, as we spoke about the development of the Pan-African Congress, things like that. Blacks have been influenced by Bolshevism. People like Hubert Harrison had come to Washington, who was a black socialist leader from the West Indies. People like Marcus Garvey. And out of this becomes the development of the internal system of repression with the development of the FBI and others. And of course, J. Edgar Hoover is here from Washington, and the first people they're spying on are the African-American community. So all of this is reflective of what happens there. And all of this creates the desire for finding whatever way possible to gain freedom, and therefore art becomes this way. As you mentioned, and you want us to get to, it is a big debate about whether art what role it should play. It's no different than it is now. You know, when Laura Ingraham tells LeBron to shut up and dribble, she's saying the same thing to him. She says, you don't have a right because who you are to express yourself. You see, he can express himself through his view of art, being a great basketball player, which is art in itself, but also as a human being. And so the question becomes, how do you do this? And the role of the university in creating this. And it's not just a question in New York, in Washington, because the question starts in New York. Is a difference between the Urban League grouping and the NAACP. It's a difference between certain levels of elite Blacks, because they are differences in Blacks. Du Bois has a talented 10th theory. In Washington, you can say, when I came to Washington, elite Blacks held their nose up at people. In Washington, elite Blacks hold their nose at people. They can say they don't, but I know it's true. Until I became Dr. Jackson, some treated me pretty, but you know, what do I care about such things? But you still have this, and it's probably and it's part of the reason of this you know, Isabel Wilson talks about a caste divide, but in Washington, you did have a caste system. And so forth amongst a certain levels of Blacks. So all of these things are coming in attention. That's why when you take the theater, and the theater has the ability to not just reenact, but to put a lot of history in one place. The theater, some things you can't do it. Poetry in the theater, you have a way, because you can tell a whole total totality. That is why when Eugene O'Neill wrote the Emperor Jones, and then Robeson took the Emperor Jones, and he translated that to be Toussaint Louverture. I am the Emperor Jones, and this was Robeson's look at how Toussaint Louverture could come out and express himself. And then Jacob Lawrence took the same thing and had this art exhibit, this big art, the Toussaint series. But they took this because Toussaint had been the great liberator. And so all of these things African Americans are using, and they put this on the stage.
You know, I think listening to Maurice, there is a really essential point here, which is continuity of issues and positions, and the fact that throughout American history, we've had these tensions running through from the founding of the country, from the arrival of Europeans here, from the arrival of Africans here. These are tensions which are held in balance with one another. And there is no right answer to the question of propaganda or art. It's really not either or. They're different dimensions of the same challenge, which is how do people establish their humanity? And it's the role of the arts in establishing humanity that I think is critically important. And it comes out in theater, it definitely comes out in music. And you know, when we focus on politics all the time, we tend to forget the human that underlies a lot of these tensions. And once you understand that we're talking about humans trying to express themselves, they're expressing different dimensions of themselves. They're expressing anger. They're expressing frustration. They're also expressing the reality that I am here and should be recognized and respected. And I think the so-called difference in theater, it comes out all the discussions in the 1990s around the work of August Wilson, the criticism he took for declaring himself a race man. It's the same discussion. And of course, if you take a look at the Wilson discussion, you had critics saying, well, there's a universal humanity, and why are you peddling your particularistic point of view? But of course, that universal humanity is defined not by Wilson, but by white American critics who are criticizing him. So these are tensions. They're not resolved, but it's important to understand that these are tensions which have existed for a long time in American society and in American art, and they give out of this conflict comes tremendous energy and creativity. And I think the people I write about are just one more example of how people in the arts are able to take their thoughts, emotions, and feelings and translate them into something which communicates to others.
Thanks, Blair. I wanted to, over to Professor Jackson, but I wanted to just build on Blair's comment to you, Professor Jackson. And I wanted to fast forward up to the 1960s. Now, that was another era. You had the civil rights movement and a real renaissance in African-American art and the ability to be to have their voices heard in an authentic way, and where the politics and the art came together in a very interesting way that's hard to, that needs to be unpacked. And I was wondering if you would fast forward us to the 1960s, and if you would have any comment on that era and whether there was any resonance in the 60s from what had occurred during the period Blair was writing about.
Of course, just as the Black Black Lives Matter movement, some people think they've created everything. Some of the people in the 60s, in the Southern movement, in SNCC and CORE and places like that, thought they had created everything, but they hadn't. Before them came the Southern Negro Youth Congress. Before them came the National Negro League. Before them came many other things like this. And of course, in the 60s, there were many different, and people expressed it in many ways. And sometimes people get rather silly. For example, John Coltrane wrote a tune called Alabama. And it was a debate about, well, John Coltrane wasn't political. Well, who would name anything Alabama unless it had some politics to it? What Black man growing up inside is going to name something Alabama with the way people are being treated? I lived some years as a kid. My grandmother was from Alabama. She raised me. So I lived there with her a couple of years. And he named it after the young girls who were killed in Birmingham. Here you had the development of the Black arts movement and the Black repertoire theater, which Blair will talk about, but the Black artists who were expressing themselves. I've been reading about a woman, Alma Thomas, who was the great folk artist of Washington, very quiet lady, woman who had taught not at Dunbar, but at Armstrong, went back to college to Howard and became the first graduate of the Howard's art school. And just a lovely lady who didn't go out and necessarily preach civil rights or anything, but she had her art, and she drew two pieces of art around a march on Washington, two different ones. She didn't have to say a word about it, but it expressed her view. And then you had the more open people. You remember Amir Baraka goes to Howard, and A.B. Spellman and people like that, and they are there creating this art. And they, of course, are more vocal. The SNCC leaders, all of those come out of Hardin. People today, we've just seen the Washington International Film Festival, where the leader of the student movement was Tony Gittins, who was there. The whole Berry administration, we look at Marion Berry, we look at John Wilson, you look at Cortland Cox, you look at many people like that who were trained under SNCC and use those organizing skills. And then, of course, last week, there was a big program on WPFW radio about Bernice Johnson Reagan, the woman who, you must remember, and Blair knows too, that for a certain time, certain African Americans did not want to sing the Negro spirituals because they took them back to the past. Remember, in part, even during the DC Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance, people wanted to divorce themselves from what they consider lower class culture. Until Sterling Brown came and speaking about the Southern ways, and Zora Neale Hurston and others. So you have these conflicts. But and so the Black arts movement in the 60s revised some of those, the great work of people like Lou Stovall, who's still producing. And Lou Stovall produces art, and the art is used for posters and things like that. So you have all of this going on, and Lou Stovall creates all the art, a lot of the art for the Black repertoire theater and other things like that. So you have the use, and so now when you see all these murals are being built, they are built based on what the great muralists did from Diego Rivera and others from the 30s and 40s and so forth, and then picked up again in the 60s. So it's all, I tell my students, it's very seldom does anybody create anything new, but what they do is take that which is before him, if they have any sense, and then use it for the betterment of humanity. That's what the Black arts movement did. That's what we hope the Black Lives Matter movement would do.
Let me say a word about DC Black Rep, which was founded by Robert Hooks in 1971. And yesterday happened to be the 49th anniversary gathering. It was virtual, but gathering of alumni of the DC Black Rep. And I think it's an interesting story. When I first started poking around, people mentioned to me, oh, there was this theater, but it never really got off the ground. It didn't really amount to anything. Well, that's not really quite true. A number of very important artists came through the DC Black Rep Company. The founders of the Ellington School. There were Sweet Honey in the Rock, you mentioned Regan. The Dance Wing produced internationally renowned choreographers who went on to Broadway in London and are working now in Amsterdam. And I think it's an example of how at times when you take a quick look at Washington's contributions, it gets denigrated. And in fact, Robert Hooks did a great thing. He was a Washington native. He was working in New York, very successful. You would recognize him from some of his TV and film roles. And he gave everything up to come to Washington to start a company that would serve as a cornerstone of community arts. And he eventually just didn't have enough money to keep it going, but its impact is long lasting. And I think this is also part of the story of the people I'm writing about. And I think Maurice just really hit the nail on the head. It's part of a continuity that can be built upon by others who come afterwards. So I think definitely the 1960s and 70s here in Washington built on what had come before. Let's remember that this was a city that did not have home rule, and that was the arts were an important way to express political points of view. And we kind of move along and we kind of forget things, but these were important moments, not just in our own city's history, but these are people who went out in the world and changed the world.
And as we talk about it, it's just important for people to remember just how hard things were in Washington in the 20s and the 30s. The movement that really brought about desegregation came in the 50s, but blacks couldn't buy houses. Blacks couldn't get jobs. Theater is a luxury for many people. Before you can go to theater, you must eat. 1949, a report comes out commissioned by Truman, talks about Washington. This is long before the current report. The two societies in Washington that are dividedly segregated, and blacks. People make a lot about there were no color only and white only signs in Washington. It really doesn't make any difference whether there was a sign or not. You knew there was the de facto rule, and this is what Wilson did. We've just discovered, they discovered later on these lost laws, which said that the Reconstruction laws, which allowed for pure integration, had never been written off the books. But it didn't matter because they weren't enforced. And so you had all of these conditions that existed. And this art began to reflect reality. And as Blair said, the Black repertory theater, when it came in, well, this great Black theater with Black voices, with men and women expressing their own, and going back to Howard University. And at all times, this is supported. Even though Sterling Brown gets older and older, he stays young because people like he continue to support this. Just like Louis Armstrong never said a negative thing about the young advanced guard of people playing new jazz. May it be Ornette Coleman or Dizzy Gillespie, whoever it was. Sterling Brown was the same way, always supporting the young people, movement towards change.
Well, thank you. The Wilson Center is the nation's official memorial to our United States 28th president, and we take that mission seriously and evaluate Wilson's legacy in all of its dimensions. And we are coming to terms with, and it's framing our debate as we examine Wilson's historical role of, on the one hand, promoting internationalism and democratic transformation abroad, while pursuing segregationist policies at home with racist blinders that he had. And grappling with this contradiction in the Wilson presidency, today's discussion with Blair and Professor Jackson is part of this ongoing process of evaluating Wilson's role. Today, we focused on the issue of the arts in Washington, D.C., but it really provided a window into a broader set of issues, as we heard from both Blair and Professor Jackson. This has been a very rich discussion. Thank you, Professor Jackson, for virtually visiting the Wilson Center to participate in today's discussion. Blair, bravo, kudos. You are indeed the Renaissance man, and your productivity is a marvel and an inspiration to us. The book is Portraying the Soul of a People. It's available on the Wilson Center's website. Thanks to all who have participated virtually in today's event. Thank you again, Blair and Professor Jackson. We are adjourned.
Thank you very much. Good seeing you.